Wyoming Territory, autumn of 1878. The wind carried the scent of pine and gunpowder through the foothills west of Laramie when Quillan Tate spotted her. She was barefoot, her dress torn, blood dried across her temple, and her eyes wide like a deer caught in torchlight. Her steps were uneven, like each one betrayed her. She came out from the trees just as Quillan was watering his horse near a shallow stream. She froze when she saw him. Then her knees gave out. Quillan dropped the reins and ran. "Madam Hay," he caught her just before she hit the ground. "You hurt bad." She blinked up at him, her lips cracked and dry. She stared at his face. A long pause, her eyes filled with tears. "I know you." Quillan's brow drew down. "You do?" "I do not know my name," she whispered, "but I know your face." Her voice broke on those last words, and Quillan felt something in him shift. She was trembling, half-conscious and light as a fawn in his arms. He wrapped his coat around her and carried her to his horse. He had seen bandit raids before. He had worked cattle over rough land, fought off rustlers, helped bury neighbors. But this woman, something about the way she looked at him, like he was the only solid thing in her world, rattled him. Her head lolled against his chest as he rode with her toward his cabin, 3 miles west up the ridge. Quillan lived alone in a one-room cabin with a lean-to shed and a corral out back. He had built it after the war, after too many years of riding with the 5th Cavalry and watching men break some from bullets, some from what came after. He laid her on his cot, stoked the fire and boiled water. She did not wake fully that night. She tossed in her sleep, murmured things that did not make sense. Once she whispered, "They took everything," and flinched like she was being struck. The next morning her eyes opened slow and wary. She looked around the cabin, then at him. "You are real," she said softly. Quillan nodded. "You remember anything yet?" She sat up, wincing. "No, only your face. You were there after. I found you walking near the ridge. You were alone." She swallowed hard. Her hands trembled as she picked at the blanket. "There was smoke, screaming, horses. I ran, I fell. Then I saw you." "Bandits," she nodded. "I think so. Do you know your name?" She shook her head. "Well," Quillan said, kneeling beside the cot, "I need to call you something." She studied him for a beat, then said, "Brielle, that feels right." "Brielle," he repeated, testing it on his tongue. "Brielle what?" She frowned. "I do not know." "That is all right." He gave her a nod. "I am Quillan Tate." She watched him with cautious eyes. "Why did you help me?" He blinked. "Because you needed help." She stared at him like that was the most honest thing she had ever heard. Over the next days, Brielle stayed in Quillan's cabin. She moved slowly, wary of sudden sounds. He gave her space, but he cooked, chopped wood, kept the fire going. She took comfort in the rhythm of his days. One afternoon she was sitting on the porch when she asked, "What do you do out here all alone?" Quillan glanced at her from where he was oiling his saddle. "I work cattle sometimes. Handle mail for the stage line when the driver is short. Mostly I keep to myself." "No wife?" He shook his head. "No, just me." She tilted her head. "That seems lonely." He shrugged. "Some things are easier that way." But Brielle was not easy to ignore. She found ways to help, sweeping the floor, mending a ripped shirt, even baking cornbread with what little they had. Her presence filled the space in a way he had not realized he needed. One night after supper they sat by the fire. She was quiet. "You all right?" Quillan asked. "I keep trying to remember," she said. "Who I am, where I was going, but all I get is your face." He looked down, unsure what to say. "It is not just that you found me." Her voice dropped. "It feels like I was looking for you." His chest tightened. He cleared his throat. "You should know if you want to go into town, see the sheriff, maybe someone is looking for you." "No," she said quickly. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because I feel safer here than I can remember feeling anywhere." Her voice shook. "Please, Quillan, just a little longer." He nodded. "Stay as long as you want." The next morning, smoke rose from the east ridge. Quillan mounted up, rifle slung over his shoulder. "Stay inside," he told her. He rode fast. The trail was blackened, trees still glowing with heat. A small wagon had been left behind, half burned. Blood on the dirt and bodies. He found 3. A man, a woman, and a young boy. The boy could not have been older than 7. They had been shot, their things taken. But behind a tree he heard a sound. A whimper. Quillan slowly stepped around and found her. A girl, maybe 5. Filthy, shaking, her dress torn. "Hey there," he said gently. "It is all right now, I have you." She clung to him without a word. He brought her back to the cabin. Brielle gasped when she saw the child. "Her name is Olive," Quillan said, his voice gruff. Later, after they had cleaned her up and fed her, Olive curled up in Brielle's lap like she belonged there. Brielle whispered, "She lost them all." Quillan nodded. "She is yours now if you want her." Brielle looked up, startled. "Mine? You saved her already. She trusts you." Brielle looked down at the little girl wrapped around her waist. "Yes, I will keep her safe." That night, Quillan fixed a cradle from old wood planks and put it beside the cot. Brielle kissed Olive's forehead, then turned to him. "You saved me," she said. "And now her," he shrugged. "Just doing right." She stepped closer. "Why do you always say it like it is nothing?" He looked into her eyes. "Because if I let myself think about what it means, I might not be able to walk away." "Then do not walk away," she said. He stood there, frozen, until she reached up and touched his face. "I do not remember anything," she said, "but I know I am supposed to be here, with you." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. She did not. Their lips met gently, and everything else lost, fear, silence faded. It was not just a kiss. It was understanding. It was home. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, the fire burned steady and warm. The days shortened into deeper autumn. By the time the aspens lost their last gold, Olive had begun to speak again, though only a few words at a time, and only to Brielle. She followed the woman everywhere, small hand always catching the hem of her skirt or slipping into her palm. At night, she curled between them on the cot, breath soft and steady. Quillan started sleeping on a bedroll near the hearth, which he didn't mind. The sound of their quiet breathing filled the cabin in a way the wind never had. Some mornings, Brielle stepped outside before dawn and stood on the porch, arms folded, eyes cast toward the east ridge. Quillan noticed she always stood still, like listening for something too faint to name. "You think you were heading somewhere?" he asked one morning, his breath clouding between them. He didn't raise his voice. She hadn't spoken yet. She nodded slowly. "There was a weight in my hand, something leather, I keep seeing it. A bag, maybe. Satchel, I think. I remember holding it close, like it mattered. You think it's still out there? If it is, it might have my name in it." Quillan stepped off the porch, pulling his coat tighter. "Then I'll ride the old trail again, the one you came down." She moved beside him. "I'll come." He looked at her, quiet a moment. "Only if Olive stays here with Miss Sturgis." The widow Sturgis lived down the lower slope, a half-mile east. She'd buried her husband 6 winters back and had since taken to helping neighbors with their young when needed. Olive didn't cry when Brielle explained, just held tighter for a moment, then let go. By mid-morning, Quillan and Brielle rode out, the trail damp from last night's frost melt. They said little. The trees grew denser past the ridge, their bare arms rattling in the wind. Brielle scanned the ground as they went, eyes sharp. They found the satchel near a creek bend, half buried in pine needles. Its leather was darkened with weather, one strap broken. Brielle dismounted before her horse had fully stopped and knelt beside it. She opened the flap with slow fingers. Inside were a few coins, a comb, and a folded paper. Quillan stayed a step back, not wanting to crowd her. When she unfolded the paper, her hands shook. "Is it yours?" She didn't answer for a moment, just traced the name written in faded ink at the top corner. Brielle Marchand, she read aloud. Born in New Orleans. She sat back on her heels. I had a brother, Emile. He must have written this note. There's a name here, Dr. Graham, Laramie. I must have been going there. Quillan watched her as she folded the paper again and pressed it to her chest. Her lips trembled, but she didn't cry. They rode back slow. The wind picked up and clouds gathered low over the mountains. By the time they reached the cabin, the air smelled of coming snow. That evening, Quillan chopped extra wood while Brielle bundled Olive in a quilt and read to her from an old Bible Miss Sturgis had lent them. Her voice was steady and low, the way someone might read to themselves if they were alone. After Olive drifted to sleep, Quillan sat beside the hearth, boots off, his palms warming near the flame. "You plan on going into Laramie?" he asked. Brielle sat across from him, hair damp from washing. "If that doctor knows who I am, I have to," he nodded. "I'll take you." She stared at the fire. "If I have people waiting, a life somewhere else, then we'll find out," he said, voice even. She looked at him then. "And if I don't, if this is it," he held her gaze, "then you're already home." She rose and came to sit beside him. Close but not touching. The firelight flickered across her face, casting shadows under her eyes. "I've wondered," she said after a while, "how I knew your face. From before. But maybe it wasn't before. Maybe it's just that when you looked at me, you didn't flinch." He turned his head toward her. "You looked at me like I mattered. That's not nothing." Her hand found his, fingers lacing slow. They sat like that, not saying more, until the fire settled into coals. That night, he returned to the cot. Olive lay curled toward the wall, deep asleep. Brielle lifted the quilt beside her, eyes soft but sure. He climbed in beside them, careful not to jostle. Her hand sought his under the blanket, and this time, he didn't let go. The first snow came quiet, blanketing the ridge in white before dawn. Quillan stepped out early, lantern in hand, and found the world hushed under it. The horses stood still in the corral, steam rising from their backs. Inside the cabin, Brielle was dressing Olive in wool layers, the child's cheeks still warm from sleep. He saddled the bay mare, packed biscuits and dried venison into a saddlebag, and tied the recovered satchel beneath the flap. By mid-morning, they were riding east toward Laramie, the sky pale and close. Olive rode with Miss Sturgis in a borrowed sleigh, wrapped in quilts and half asleep before they reached the first bend. Brielle rode beside him, her scarf drawn up over her ears, eyes steady on the trail. "You ever been to Laramie?" she asked after a long stretch of silence. "Only for supply runs. Stage contracts take me near enough, but I don't linger." "Why not?" "Too many doors shut fast," he said, reins loose between his fingers. "Town's changing. Folks forget who helped clear the paths they walk now." She glanced over. "You mean soldiers?" "I mean men who came back different." Brielle didn't press. Her eyes returned to the trail. "I wasn't born out here, I can feel that much. The cold doesn't settle right in my bones." "You think you'll go back east?" She didn't answer right away. "Not if it means leaving what's here." The doctor's office sat 2 blocks off the main street, a narrow building with dark green shutters and a brass plate fixed to the door. Quillan waited outside, leaning against the hitch post while Brielle stepped inside alone. She came out 30 minutes later, walking slow, her face unreadable. "Did he know you?" he asked. She nodded. "He treated me once. 2 years ago, after I fell down some steps near the depot. I'd come west looking for Emile. He was working near Laramie as a photographer." Quillan straightened. "You remember that now?" "I do, in pieces. The doctor had a note in his ledger with Emile's name. I asked around. He died last summer. Fever took him." "I'm sorry." She looked down at her gloves. "I was coming to settle his affairs. He had a cabin north of town." "No one claimed it. You want to see it? I need to. They rode out that afternoon, following a rutted path through a low valley. The cabin was small, weather-worn, one shutter hanging loose, but it stood. Brielle dismounted and stepped inside without hesitation. Quillan waited, giving her space. He heard the door open again several minutes later. "There's a chest inside," she said, "with letters. Some of them are mine. I used to write him every week. You remember writing them, not all the words, but I know my hand." She looked toward the mountains. "I'd sold my piano to buy the train fare. Thought I'd find a job teaching music out here. You still could." Her expression shifted. "Do you think folks would want that? A teacher with no past. They'd want someone who plays honest." Brielle walked slowly back to him, snow crunching beneath her boots. "The strange part is, I don't miss what I forgot. I miss what came after. The cabin. Olive's hand in mine. You, asking nothing from me but truth. You always gave it," he said. She reached for his hand. "I still don't know how I recognized your face that day, but maybe it wasn't memory. Maybe it was knowing." He drew her close. "Some things don't need explaining." They rode back as the sun dropped behind the hills, sky lit in orange and violet. The wind picked up, colder now, and Brielle leaned into him as they rode. When they returned to the cabin, Olive ran from the sleigh and threw her arms around Brielle's waist. She didn't speak, just held on. Brielle knelt, arms wrapped firm around the child. Later that night, after Olive had fallen asleep with her cheek against Brielle's shoulder, Quillan sat at the table watching the fire settle. "You planning to stay in Emil's cabin?" he asked. Brielle looked up, her hand resting on Olive's back. "I thought I might, but it's quiet there. Empty." He waited. "I don't want to raise her where it's quiet like that," she added. "I want her to grow up knowing someone will always ride home." Quillan stood and crossed to her. "Then stay here." She rose, slow and sure. "Not just for her." He touched her cheek. "I know." Their kiss was quiet, warm like the hearth beside them. Olive stirred, curling closer into Brielle's arms, unaware. The wind outside pressed against the walls, but inside the cabin held steady. Snow kept falling through the night, and in the morning they made another fire and began again. March thaw came slow that year. The snow melted in patches, revealing brown grass and packed earth beneath. Quillan turned the soil behind the cabin with a spade dulled by years of use, shaping narrow rows beside the fence for beans and onions. Brielle moved between the porch and the garden, coaxing Olive into helping, the child now steady on her feet, quieter in her fears. The cabin had changed. Not in its shape, but in how it held them. Quillan had built a second bunk along the far wall using pine boards from a collapsed trapper's shack down valley. Brielle hung a curtain between the bunks, stitched from an old sheet Miss Sturgis gave her. The space felt fuller now, lived in. There were boots by the door that weren't his, a shawl slung over the rocker, and a child's hair ribbon tied to a nail above the hearth. One evening, after Olive had fallen asleep curled beneath her patchwork quilt, Brielle sat at the table with her hands folded around a chipped mug of steeped spruce tips. She watched the steam rise, her eyes following it like smoke from a memory. "Did you ever think of going farther west?" she asked. Quillan looked up from the ledger where he was tallying seed costs. "Not past Rawlins." "Why?" "I used to think California sounded like something out of a book. Endless orchards, orange groves. You think you'd want that?" "I thought I did. But the idea of it feels too polished now. I don't belong somewhere that never sees frost." He closed the ledger. "You belong where you're needed." "I belong where I'm known," she said softly, "and I'm known here." She reached across the table. He took her hand without hesitation. "I spoke with Miss Sturgis this morning," she added. "She said there's talk of a small schoolhouse being built near the edge of town. They're looking for someone who can read and keep a room. You'll do more than that." "I'll try." She smiled faintly. And I was wondering if Olive might come with me just some mornings. She's already tracing letters on the back of flour sacks. She'll be ready before most. Brielle ran her thumb along his knuckles. You've given her steadiness. And me. He didn't answer, but the way he looked at her quiet, steady was its own reply. Spring deepened. The river swelled with meltwater, and the sound of it echoed faintly through the trees. Quillan taught Olive how to skip stones, showing her how to hold them flat and flick with the wrist. Brielle stood nearby, a basket balanced on her hip, watching them like something she never expected to have. One morning, a letter arrived by courier from Laramie. It was addressed to Brielle, the handwriting unfamiliar. She opened it at the table, eyes scanning the page slowly. From a man named Lambert, she said. He worked with Emil, helped develop his glass plates. Says he found a case of negatives marked with my name. Quillan leaned back. You want to go see them? I think I should. She folded the letter. But not alone. They rode into town 2 days later, leaving Olive with Miss Sturgis again. The light was warm, the sky thin and blue. Lambert kept a shop behind the telegraph office, cluttered with shelves of wooden frames and crates of chemicals. He was younger than they expected, with ink-stained fingers and a nervous gait. These were taken just after you arrived, he told her, setting the case on the counter. Inside were 6 glass negatives wrapped in muslin. He held one up to the light. That's you, miss. The image was faint but unmistakable. Brielle seated at a small upright piano, her fingers on the keys, her eyes focused somewhere just beyond the frame. I remember this dress, she whispered. It had pearl buttons. Lambert stepped back. Your brother wanted to document your first months out here, he said. He was proud. Brielle pressed her palm to her chest. He never said that in words. Some men don't, Quillan said quietly. She turned to him, her eyes full but dry. I think I have enough now. Of who I was. And who you are, she nodded. That part came clearer here. They thanked Lambert and left the shop just as the wind picked up, carrying the smell of warm dust and distant sage. Outside, Brielle paused. You never asked me to remember, she said. Didn't seem right to. I think that's why I did. They stood like that for a while, not rushing the moment. Then she slipped her hand into his and they walked on. Back at the cabin, Olive was sitting cross-legged on the porch, humming tunelessly as she sorted pebbles by size. She looked up when she saw them, her face lighting in full trust. That night, Brielle opened the crate of negatives and placed the photograph of herself at the piano in a shallow wooden frame Quillan had carved. She set it above the hearth. I'm not that woman anymore, she said. But she led me here. He stood at her side, arms crossed loosely. You're more now. They stood in silence, the fire casting soft light on the photograph. Behind them, Olive stirred in her sleep, and wind whispered through the chinks in the wall. Brielle leaned into Quillan, resting her head just beneath his shoulder. He didn't move, only shifted enough so she fit there more easily. And when the last log broke into embers, they turned toward bed, the curtain drifting slightly in the hush of the room, and the night settled gentle around them. The first rains came in April, soft and steady, loosening the earth and washing winter's grit from the cabin's roof. Quillan patched the lean-to between showers, lifting each board with methodical care while Brielle stitched new muslin curtains at the table. Olive sat cross-legged beneath the window, humming as she arranged dried wildflowers between pages of a worn almanac. One afternoon, a rider came up the trail, his coat marked with the county seal. He dismounted with a folded notice in hand, nodding politely when Quillan stepped down from the porch. They're naming a new male agent for the Laramie line, the man said. They'd like you to ride in and speak with the postmaster, said you've kept good records. Quillan ran a hand over the back of his neck. Didn't figure I was still in the running. Town's grown. Needs steady men. He left the notice and rode on. Quillan watched the dust settle behind him. That evening, Brielle stood at the basin, rolling up her sleeves. You thinking of saying yes? Would mean riding to town twice a week, sorting freight, bit more pay. You want it? He leaned a hip against the table. I might. But I'd only take it if it didn't pull me too far from here. She turned slightly. It wouldn't. He crossed to her, his voice lower. It'd mean I'm building something, not just passing through. She looked at him fully then. You already are. They married in May, beneath the cottonwoods near the stream. Miss Sturgis stood as witness, her gloved hands folded neatly. Olive carried a crown of wild lupine and wore a dress Brielle had sewn from one of her old skirts. Quillan wore his cavalry coat, brushed clean and buttoned high, the brass dulled but intact. They spoke their vows quiet and plain, just the words that mattered. Quillan's voice never wavered. Brielle held his hands like she'd known their shape her whole life. Afterward, they walked back to the cabin together, Olive running ahead with her arms stretched like wings. Inside, the table was set with bread Miss Sturgis had baked, and a pot of rabbit stew simmered slow on the hearth. There was no music, no crowd, just the hush of evening and the sound of rain beginning again on the roof. Later, when Olive had fallen asleep with her crown of flowers still in her hair, Brielle sat on the edge of their bed, unpinning her braid. I used to think peace was something you had to chase, she said, but it's quieter than I expected. Quillan knelt beside her, unlacing his boots. It's steadier, too. She touched his shoulder, gentle. I don't miss what I forgot. But I'd miss what we've made here. You won't have to. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. I know that now. They lay down together, the quilt pulled close, the hush between them full of warmth. Quillan's hand found hers beneath the blanket, not searching, just holding. Seasons passed. The schoolhouse opened that autumn, and Brielle taught reading by lamplight to children who came in with red cheeks and open minds. Olive sat in the front row, always watching her mother with quiet pride. On Wednesdays and Saturdays, Quillan rode into Laramie, returned with letters and parcels, and brought home wire-bound notebooks for Brielle and peppermint sticks for Olive. They planted a cherry sapling behind the cabin the following spring. Olive named it Emile. Years turned, slow and kind. The cabin stayed warm, the garden grew, and the photograph above the hearth never gathered dust. And each night when the last chores were done and the fire burned low, Brielle leaned into Quillan's shoulder, her hand resting steady over his heart. He never pulled away, not once, not ever.